Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to provide sort of an introduction to thinking about ethical theory for essentially for non-philosophers. So for the course, Ethics and Economic Behavior, I like to think about some of the foundations. Well, I'm assuming people are familiar with like basic principles of microeconomics, intermediate microeconomics, and then, I've got playlists if not, or for refresher. Then I do kind of a background thinking about introduction to behavioral economics. That's the preceding video. Then this is like video 3, lecture 3, thinking about the foundations of ethics. Now here's my dog. This is Onyx. Onyx is here on this slide, so that Onyx will be in the thumbnail for myself when I've got this video on my desktop, and that's all Onyx is there for. So it's like code to me. Everybody's like, what's the dog doing there? Anyway, so my introduction to ethics is coming from, before I go to my motivating quote, it's coming from this text, Discovering Right and Wrong. And so, I don't know, maybe I should, I don't know. So I mean for it to be kind of self-contained. I mean for you, if you want the book, that's the book. I can take Onyx away. Anyway, so I kind of give an introduction to ethics and the ethical framework kind of based on that treatment, because I think it's kind of a helpful way to, firstly, be introduced to ethical theory, secondly, to think about an application. So the application that is featured here is going to be on the Kitty Genovese murder in New York City. So I'm going to kind of talk about it. It's a sort of a tragic, sort of sad case, though I view it as interesting for these slides here because it's something that's considered by social scientists of all varieties. Economists have had something to say about it, philosophers, sociologists, and so on and so forth, psychologists. And so it's sort of like at the heart of social sciences is this sort of like kind of quintessential case with actually a lot of really interesting revisionist history as we kind of learn more about what actually happened. So I'm going to use that as the example. All right, setting the stage, the motivating quote, we are discussing no small matter, but how we ought to live. This is Socrates in Plato's Republic. Things like ethics is important, right? All right, so here's the example. Years ago, nation was stunned by a report out of New York City. So a young woman is brutally attacked and murdered in separate attacks, while otherwise reasonable law-abiding citizens didn't do anything. So during the 35-minute struggle, at least on the common account, no one called the police, no one shouted at the criminal, no one went to her aid, right? Finally, a 71-year-old woman called the police. Took them 2 minutes to arrive. She was had already passed. Only one other woman came out to testify prior to the arrival of the ambulance. Then residents from the whole neighborhood poured out of their apartments. So the question is, why not help? And the response is the accounts that were given were things like, I don't know, or I was tired, or we were afraid. There's many questions about our moral responsibility to others. That's kind of like the central at the heart of ethics. So the questions might be, well, what should these respectable citizens have done? Are such acts of omission morally blameworthy? What's the relationship between morality and religion? Morality and law? Morality and etiquette? Etiquette. I said etiquette, didn't I? Etiquette. All right, so ethics is going to be, ethics is a branch of philosophy, deals with how we ought to live, and that's going to be kind of like the central approach that we'll take here, even though like those other interdisciplinary things certainly matter. It concerns the idea of the good, concepts of right and wrong, where the main in the main characteristic of the discipline of philosophy is the rational argument. The idea is like philosophers wanted to clarify concepts, analyze, test propositions and beliefs, though the main task is to analyze and construct arguments. Right? To organize thinking and to come up with actually like the sort of quintessential structure, premises leading to conclusion, right? All right, so the main task is to analyze and construct arguments. The laboratory of the philosopher is the domain of ideas, although there's some really interesting experimental philosophy done, especially at University of Arizona, where I had been. So anyway, matter of fact, my my graduate level philosophy background is entirely from the University of Arizona. I didn't get to do any experimental philosophy, sadly. Anyway, so it takes place in the mind where imaginative thought experiments occur, or in the study room where arguments are written down and scrutinized, or in conversation and debate where thesis and counter example and or counter thesis are considered. All right, so sorry, I'm going over the lecture here. Usually, I do my standard preparation for the lecture and come in and deliver the lecture. Here, I'm trying to film 3 lectures in one sitting, which is a lot of being in front of this microphone. So I'll do my best to bring it for this one. We'll see. I don't know. All right, so as regards moral and ethical, we're going to use those terms interchangeably. And so we'll use moral, we'll use ethical, kind of the same, and that's not something that I'll be very picky about. Just in terms of like getting our bearings within ethics, the key divisions are between descriptive morality, between moral philosophy, so ethical theory, and then applied ethics. A lot of what we're going to be doing here is going to be closest to like applied ethics. Descriptive morality is thinking about like actual beliefs, customs, principles, practices. Sociologists pay attention to these and then examine them as cultural facts. Moral philosophy or ethical theory. So this is thinking about like the systematic ethical foundation, right? Thinking about understanding moral concepts and then therefore using this to justify moral principles and theories. Here you're thinking about analyzing right, wrong, permissible, and ultimately trying to think about action guides for individuals and then for groups. So think about like normative ethics. Applied ethics deals with controversial moral problems, right? Thinking about applications to sweatshops, price gouging, corruption, a lot of which we'll think about in the context of this course. So the larger study of ethics encompasses all of these. All right, so kind of the key quote from the book that I want to bring out is, if we are to endure as a free, civilized people, we must take ethics more seriously than we have before. Ethical theory might rid us of simplistic extremism and emotionalism where shouting matches replace arguments. Ethical theory clarifies relevant concepts, constructs and evaluates arguments and guides us on how to live our lives. It's important that the educated person be able to discuss ethical situations with precision and subtlety. And actually, in the context of the course here, if you want to write from an ethical perspective, you want to write with precision and subtlety and clarity. We're going to compare morality to other normative subjects. So moral principles are thinking about standards of behavior. They involve not what is, but what ought to be. So for instance, how should I live my life? What's the right thing to do in this situation? Morality has, therefore, distinct action guiding and normative aspect. It's similar to like law, etiquette, and religion. So the traits of moral principles, well, the central feature of morality is moral principle. There's no universal agreement on the traits a moral principle must have, but there's a wide consensus that moral principles must have or has these 5 features: prescriptivity, universalizability, overridingness, publicity, and practicability. Prescriptivity is the practice or action guiding nature. So this is the idea that moral principles are designed for use, right? The idea is to be able to advise people, to influence action, right? So it's like giving us imperatives or commands, what you ought to do. And it shares this trait with all normative discourse as used to appraise behavior, assign praise and blame, provide feelings of satisfaction or guilt. Universalizability is the idea that the moral principles must apply to all people who are in a relatively similar situation. So if one judges that act X is right for certain person P, it's right for anyone relatively similar to P. So this is an extension of the principle of consistency. One's got to be consistent about one's value judgments, including moral judgments. So for instance, take any act that you're contemplating and ask, could I will that everyone act according to this principle? If you study philosophy, that might be reminiscent of Kant. Overridingness. So moral principles have a predominant authority and override other types of principles, right? We have a lot of principles. They're not the only principle that govern our behavior, but they take precedence over other considerations, including aesthetic, prudential, and legal ones. Or we believe they ought. Publicity. Moral principles must be made public in order to guide our actions, right? People have to know about it to be able to follow it, right? Publicity is necessary. If we use principles to prescribe behavior, give advice, assign praise and blame, be self-defeating to keep them secret. Practicability. Moral principle must have practicability, meaning it must be workable. Cannot lay a heavy burden on us when we follow them, right? So think of like bounded rationality. Think about the limitations of humans to be able to calculate and come up with the right economic behavior. Well, certainly, right? We also need principles that are not overly burdensome on average moral agents, right? Rawls speaks of the strains of commitment that overly idealistic principles may cause in average moral agents. So most ethical systems take human limitations into consideration. All right, so most ethical analysis falls into domains of action, consequences, character, and motive. So we'll explore that here. So going back to the initial example, suppose one of the neighbors heard the struggle and screams after the attacker to scare them away. Well, in terms of action, one way of ethically assessing the situation is to examine the actions of both the attacker and then the good neighbor. Looking at actions, the attacker's actions are wrong. The neighbor's actions are right. Here, right has two meanings, though. What do we mean by right? Well, right can be obligatory, as in the right act, or permissible in the sense of a right act, or something that's all right to do. Typically, philosophers will define right as permissible, and then including in that category what is also obligatory. Right? So a right act is permissible. It can be obligatory, meaning the very act that morality requires of you. Therefore, it's not permissible to refrain from doing an obligatory act. It could be an optional act, one that's neither obligatory nor wrong. It's not your duty to do it, nor to avoid doing. And then a wrong act is one that you have an obligation or duty to avoid, right? It's not permissible. It's not permissible to do it. So, for instance, the attacker's action is wrong. The good neighbor's act is obligatory. This seems to follow our moral intuitions, right? I mean, obviously, the attacker's act is wrong, no question. The good neighbor's act is obligatory. It's not optional, right? You have to intervene. You've got to do something, right? Okay, so some acts seem not obligatory or wrong. The decision is considered morally neutral or optional, right? The decision to use a pen or pencil, take notes in class, or to listen to a lecture on a tablet or cell phone or a laptop, right? It's morally neutral. Then within the range of permissible acts are also supererogatory acts, those that are highly altruistic. This is interesting. Supererogatory are those that go above and beyond, right? These go beyond the call of duty. So such as if the good neighbor were to physically confront the attacker, right? You got to do something, got to intervene, but if you're able to stop the attack just by calling out or saying that you're called the police are on the way or whatever, that's what's obligatory. If you actually physically confront the attacker, we might say that that's supererogatory. It goes above and beyond. This would have been my second paper. Yeah, my second paper that I wrote in grad school was on supererogatory behavior, looking at in extensive form games, thinking about it like a model of reciprocity or model of kindness. If you were to choose in a way that leads to an outcome that gave the co-player a higher payoff than what they were expecting or somehow entitled to, this supererogatory goes above and beyond what you're called to do. So anyway, paper never went anywhere, but I'd be interested in bringing it back. Now as I'm reading over this, that's actually kind of a cool idea. Anyway, so as we're thinking about our structure here, a right act is one that's permissible. It could be obligatory. It could be optional, right? If it's obligatory, you have to do it. You can't not do it. If it's optional, then you can do it or you might not do it. It could be neutral or it could be supererogatory. Neutral meaning doesn't matter if you do it or not, no moral content, or supererogatory means going above and beyond. So it's super good to do. A wrong act is simply just not permissible. All right, so now in terms of like the ethical theories, so sort of an introduction, one important type of ethical theory emphasizes the nature of the act. That's deontological ethics. This is duty-based ethics. So these theories hold there's something inherently right or good about acts such as truth-telling or promise-keeping, right? Think of like Kant and the famous prohibition on telling lies. On the other hand, there's something inherently wrong about lying and promise breaking, right? Something inherently wrong against some type of duty, right? Leading proponent of deontological ethics is Immanuel Kant. Kant defended a principle of moral duty called the categorical imperative, right? Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it becomes universal law. So there's an inherent duty to perform right actions and avoid bad actions. Then there's consequentialism. Consequences. Another way of ethically assessing situations is to look at the consequences of the action. The consequences are on the balance positive, the action's right. If on balance negative, action's wrong. And once I've introduced these theories, then I'll bring it back to the example. Right, so looking at ethical consequences. The attacker, the negative aspects, well, they harm the woman, traumatize the community. Positive aspects, well, some sadistic pleasure. That's temporary for the criminal themselves. On balance, well, that's overwhelmingly negative, right? The consequences are overwhelmingly negative, therefore wrong. What about the neighbor? Well, they incur fear. Temporary, so that's bad, but then they intervene and that's good. On balance, the act of the neighbor is overwhelmingly positive, therefore is right to do, right? You might recognize this as being kind of in the vein of utilitarianism, right? Ethical theories focusing on consequences are like utilitarianism. Think of like Bentham and then John Stuart Mill. Mill says actions are right in the proportion that they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. Good. And then some ethical theories focus on character, on virtue. This is virtue-based ethics. So the attacker is a bad person, principally for having the bad character trait of malevolence, a predisposition to act in harmful ways. The neighbor has the good trait, benevolence, which directs their outlook on life, treats others with kindness, assists those in need. And entire theories of morality arise from these notions, such as the virtue theories of Aristotle. The idea is like virtuous people spontaneously do the right thing, may not even consciously follow moral rules when doing so. The vicious person does the opposite. People are complicated, though. That's sort of my criticism, which is like, you might, I don't know. So maybe the person just like treats everybody with kindness, assists those in need. Who knows? All right, the motive. Virtually all ethical theories recognize the importance of motives. So for the full assessment of any action, it's important to take into consideration motives. So for instance, suppose John pushes Mary off a ledge and breaks her leg. Well, that's not good for Mary. It doesn't reflect good on John. Could be he's angry and wishes to harm her. Well, that's the wrong thing. So that's really bad. Or it could be there's danger. There's a knife flying and intends to save her life. Then he had the right motivation, right? So the idea is like we want to take into consideration motives as well. All right. So this is sort of an overview, thinking about ethical analysis. The goal, once again, introducing. So what's the highlights from the lecture that's super important? Well, this breakdown of right and wrong with the language of permissible and not permissible, obligatory, optional, neutral, and supererogatory. The next thing that's important is thinking about deontological ethics, duty-based, consequentialism, thinking about on balance, the good or bad that's created, and then ethical theories focusing on character or virtue ethics. And then we saw kind of how to apply each of the ethical theories in our analysis, right? And so that's kind of the key, is we're focusing on ethics in economic behavior. To the extent that we're interested in ethics, we're going to be interested in, analyzing relative to, one of these theories. Okay, very good. I hope you enjoyed the video. Here I'm seeing myself it's like super lagged. Hopefully the video, that was really distracting to me. Hopefully it wasn't too bad for you. If you've made it to the end, then I'm guessing maybe not. So anyway, hope you liked the video. See you for the next one.